Welcome to The Hot Seat, your go to podcast for talking about current social and political issues. I am your host, Gianna, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the death penalty, specifically why the United States justice system should not have the power to assign death as a punishment for a crime. So grab your snacks and let's get started. So, I think in order to talk about the death penalty, we need to have a background on where it is currently in the United States. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, there are 21 states that retain the death penalty and use it. There are 23 states that have abolished the death penalty, and there are 6 states, including California, that have placed a hold on any and all executions until further notice. Another question I wanted to touch on was which groups of people were more affected by the death penalty. According to a New York Times article, a study found that killers of white people were more than 4 times as likely to be sentenced to death as killers of black people, and defendants convicted of killing white victims were executed at a rate 17 times greater than those convicted of killing black victims. These statistics go to show the racial bias living within the justice system that makes it dangerous for them to be allowed to enforce the death penalty if it can't ensure that it's going to be used in an equal, fair, and just way, and that defendants who are guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt, and it is unquestionable whether they committed the crime or not. This brings me to my next piece of evidence, the case of Walter McMillian as told by Bryan Stevenson in Just Mercy. Walter McMillian was convicted by an almost all-white jury and sentenced to death row for a murder that he did not commit. His conviction was based on false testimonies that were coerced by the police and the investigators at the time, despite his alibi, which was corroborated by several witnesses that saw him the day of the murder. Walter McMillian's story is a prime example of how black people and people of color fall victim to the racism of law enforcement officers and the corruption of the justice system that sees them not as an individual but as the stereotype that paints them as violent criminals. Which brings me into my next talking point. The innocent people that were potentially killed on death row and the amount of people that have since been exonerated after being convicted and placed on death row. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, 197 people have been exonerated and released from death row since 1973, and 80% of black exonerees who were sentenced to death were victims of official misconduct compared to 67% of white death row exonerees. First off, these statistics show that the cases of both white and black defendants were mishandled, which could very well have been the reason that they were convicted to death row instead of being sentenced to life in prison or maximum sentences for their crime. This also shows that black people are disproportionately convicted and sentenced as opposed to their white counterparts. In Just Mercy, Walter McMillian had already served years on death row when Bryan Stevenson appealed his case and brought in new evidence that completely contradicted all of the evidence being used against McMillian in the original trial. He also brought in and questioned Ralph Myers, the sole witness from the original trial that placed McMillian at the scene of the crime, and revealed that Myers had lied in his original testimony and had not seen nor met McMillian before he was brought in as a witness on the case. The amount of people exonerated and the sheer bigotry displayed in the original trial that convicted Walter McMillian should be evidence enough that the death penalty should not be a viable option if it cannot be used objectively and without bias. This brings me into my last talking point, the ethicality of the death penalty and its methods of execution. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the most common method of execution is lethal injection. So let's talk about what it does and what is supposed to happen to the body of an inmate when injected. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, in the one drug executions, the prisoner is injected with an overdose of pentobarbital. In the multi-drug executions, it starts with a sedative, previously sodium thiopental, but more recently drugs such as midazolam, which is supposed to put the prisoner to sleep. Next, a paralytic drug, typically vecuronium bromide or pancuronium bromide, is injected, which paralyzes the entire muscle system and stops the prisoner's breathing. The death penalty has been a topic for debate for decades, with the ethics of it being the center of the conversation on the issue. So far, the most humane way of execution has been lethal injection. But the questions lie with how humane can you be when it involves taking the life of someone else, whomever they may be, or whatever actions they've taken. Can you talk about ethicality and executing someone, killing someone in the same conversation? Can the two go hand in hand? Take, for example, the story of John Evans in the book Just Mercy and the affidavit his attorney wrote after viewing his client's execution. He wrote that his client had to be shocked 3 times before the doctors in the room pronounced he was dead. And each time he was shocked, he described seeing smoke from under the cover that was on his head and the smell of burnt flesh from the electrocution. I mean, the story of this particular inmate just shows how brutal an execution can be. No matter how you look at it, it is taking somebody's life. So the question still remains, can an execution ever be humane? Whether it's electrocution, whether it's lethal injection, whether it's gas, hanging, whatever. Can it be humane in any way? I'm going to hand it over to my audience. What do you guys think? Should the criminal justice system in any state be allowed to enforce the death penalty? They condemn murderers and killers, so should they be held to the same standard when it comes to taking a human life? Thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Hot Seat, and I'll see you guys next time.